this does not have to be the most expensive thing in the world for companies. If we were trying to stop loot boxes, yeah, they would fight that to hell and back, because that could be worth billions to the industry. So it's an existential risk for some of them. We're just trying to say, no, you just need to have something so that the consumer isn't completely screwed at the end of this.
I want to talk about you and your initiative and everything that's going on over here. We talked about briefly about Stop Killing Games, but why don't you just like give everybody a rundown of this movement, how it got started, and what we have to look forward to with this?
Sure. Well, again, recap: Stop Killing Games is, we're trying to legally challenge the practice of publishers just kind of completely disabling games you've already paid for and just leaving you with nothing at the end of it. And this is an issue that's just bugged me for decades, to be honest. I mean, even before the game's shut down, just knowing that, oh, well, here's a great game. Too bad I don't know when it's going to be destroyed. I mean, whereas, you were talking about like Mario All-Stars. I bet if you got a copy of it, that's it. That's yours for life. You
Right.
know? Like, you want to come back to that anytime you want. And we've seen the industry kind of shift more and more on that. Well, again, the legality of it just hasn't been tested in other countries. So late last year, no, the year before, I'm getting my years mixed up.
Yeah, sure.
There was I've been always looking for an opening on this, but again, in the US, it's like my mind's going all over the place. In the US, I was never able to find like a great angle on this, because in theory you have consumer rights, but then when it comes to games, it's like you don't. But then it was difficult to find like, well, what laws pertain to this? And it just felt like a dead end on it. But what I found was that in other countries, this wasn't established at all. The big ones are especially countries in the European Union and Australia, where they have much stronger consumer rights laws. And I guess, last year, a big game that was a perfect candidate for this sort of thing to test it of the consumer agencies was The Crew.
Right.
So this was a good candidate because this is a driving game by Ubisoft, but it sold, or there were at least 12 million players total for the player base. So that meant a lot of people still had receipts that they could send to a consumer agency. It also is what I call a clean kill, which means that they shut that down. Everybody was left with nothing. It wasn't like, oh, the DLC doesn't work anymore, or, oh, the multiplayer doesn't work, but the single player works. So this is something a consumer agency, which might know nothing about video games, could grasp and understand. And the big important factor was Ubisoft is a French publisher, which has way more laws on their consumer rights and what applies or not. So it was really the perfect candidate almost for this sort of thing. So we got a bunch of people to basically send in complaints to countries where they would listen. And actually for France in particular, you're not going to get compensated, but they would accept complaints on this worldwide. Mm-hmm. So literally every owner that heard about this was able to send complaints, which ended up being thousands coming into their office. And since then, the legality of this, which government's looking into this, is like, hey, is this legal to just take this game from everybody and not tell them when you were going to do it, when they bought it, that sort of thing? So far, we still don't have answers, but it's been escalated in France, Germany, and Australia are the big ones. So the angle we're going for is, if it's found that for this to not be lawful, that might actually end the practice more or less globally. Because what would happen is, say, like France and Germany, I forget the population of them, but it's in the tens of millions. Mm-hmm. So what publishers would have to do is they would see it as, okay, if we're going to release our game in France or Germany in the future, we need an end of life plan before we do this. Otherwise, we're going to get fined or not be allowed into the market. And that's, potentially millions of copies they could sell. Whereas if you need to have an end of life plan for a video game from the beginning, it's not heaven and earth to try to make it happen. We've seen a few cases where the publishers do this on their own, like Knockout City was a recent example where they had to shut it down, so they patched it on the way out that you could host the server privately and people could connect to it. So now that game's safe for all time, pretty much. Now that's the one angle we've been pursuing, and that's all underway, and we just have to wait and see what happens. But while I was at this, I realized that there were some governments allowed you to petition them directly, where you could propose essentially new law on this. And one of those, the biggest one that has the most teeth on it, that's still ongoing until August, is again the European Citizens Initiative, where pretty much anybody who's a citizen of an EU country, if they can sign this and just say, yes, we wish to have basically rights to keep our video games when we buy them. If enough people do that, it goes before the EU Commission, and I personally think there's a very high chance we could end this, because the law is such a complete no man's land. It doesn't say this is legal. It doesn't say it's not legal. So if a bunch of consumers are rolling up saying, hey, we just want basic consumer rights, it might be the path of least resistance than to try to figure out how this applies to laws that were never written for this.
Well, this seems like a really, pretty basic idea. You buy a product, you own the product, it's your product, right? And you're saying if you have the product, at least have a window on it, almost like you go into the grocery store and you buy some food and it has a best buy date, right? And you're more or less saying, well, let's give this a window like you would, most other consumable products. But not everybody has been on board with this idea. Like
it gets complicated. It
right
quickly, like, because you're talking about food. That's one analogy, but let's say something like you're talking about video rentals, or that's another thing. It's not always clear if these are considered rentals or if you're buying them. It's kind of, but with rentals, almost every service or rental or subscription service, it's either they give you a date when it ends. Like if you sign up for Netflix or something, you're told 30 days and then your access ends. And a few games are like that, like World of Warcraft or Final Fantasy 14. Those we probably wouldn't make any progress on, because they really do kind of meet the consumer definition of a service. But thankfully, that's not that many games nowadays that charge that way. Most of them, you buy it, and then it says in the end user license agreement that we can end this at any time for any reason. Now, again, in the USA, that's pretty much the full story, unfortunately.
Right.
But like, again, in France, that's not clear, or most EU countries, that's not clear at all, because they have this directive that protects consumers against unfair contract terms. And it seems to fit this situation entirely. So if those terms are unfair, well, then how long are you expected to keep the game? I mean, there's no standard on that either, because I think we saw recently Concord just getting shut down, like 2 weeks or something.
Yeah, it was like 8 days, something like that.
Yeah. And then another example is Guild Wars, where you could have bought that 2005. That game still runs, and they're still supporting it. So there's no standard at all. There's no time frame, no standard. So we're kind of forcing the EU essentially to either give us rights or say we have no rights, because right now it's just in a complete fog, and that's the aspect that always drove me crazy about it.
Ross, I did want to let you know that if you are looking for a copy of Concord, I actually do have a couple of copies.
That's going to be a collector's item. You better hold on to it.
2 copies. My investment has not gone very well so far, as they've dipped in value, but we'll see. We'll see what happens over the years. So, yeah. So okay. So what are like the criticisms of this? Like,
many. Our biggest criticism by far is for something we're not asking for and not doing.
Okay.
Which is, the biggest criticism is, well, you can't expect companies to support a game forever. Mm-hmm. And we agree 100%. We want companies to be able to walk away from a game whenever they want to. What we're asking for is basically having end of life plans be mandatory, so that when they do have to shut it down and support, there's like a final patch or something, so you could run it or host the game. Or in some games where you can't even host it on the platform that you bought it on. To basically release some way to do that, like, the server files, even if it's meant for like a completely different software. Or one thing we'd be willing to negotiate down to would be the equivalent of repair instructions, where, okay, we can't release all the code for you, but we'll release all this relevant stuff with how the networking protocols work, so that you'd have a fair chance. Well, smarter people than me could have a fair chance of coming up with a server emulator for it.
Right. I think like everything you're saying sounds very fair to me, just from a consumer perspective. Obviously we're big on consumer rights and such. I know that me personally, we've all played games that we can no longer play now, whether they were limited edition games or like a free to play, type of marketing game. I don't know. Like for me, one of my favorite games ever legitimately was like Super Mario 35. I don't know if you ever had a chance to play that. Yeah. So this is a game that Nintendo released for a year for the Mario 35th anniversary. And it was a battle royale style game with Super Mario Brothers. I loved this game, but now they did say it was only going to be available for a year when they announced it, but there was, it wasn't monetized. It was a free game. You couldn't add like costumes and such. And I think that's the thing that drove me most crazy about them letting go of this game and letting it just, die, was there's so many opportunities for it to be monetized. Like you could have changed Mario's outfit. You could have been, you could have done costumes or, all sorts of microtransactions, but they didn't want to offer any of that stuff. And there was a very, I would say, very active community behind this game that certainly was interested in supporting it. But they ultimately decided against it, which for me broke my little Mario loving heart. So,
well, sorry to pile onto it, but even if we got everything we're asking for, because if the game was just truly free, as in here you go, try it out, then this wouldn't affect that at all. Because if the game is just 100% free, then there's not really any commerce going on. So there's not really any
Ross.
Yeah. But what the other aspect of that is, if they actually told you exactly when it was going to shut down, we will try to have some measure of preservation for those, but we'd almost certainly lose, because their only argument at that point is just for kind of cultural preservation. And the laws on that are nothing compared to consumer law. So that's the thing. If they're telling you exactly when it ends, then it's kind of fits the definition of a service. Now, the good news is the vast majority of companies don't want to do that for multiple reasons. I mean, one, that's less people are going to buy the game if it's in your face when it's going to end, because most people want to. I mean, most games that you do buy, they do kind of last indefinitely, as long as you have a system that can work for it and that sort of thing. That's kept in good shape. But the other aspect is, say the game is a flop. Well, then they don't want to even support it that long. They'd rather just kill it off as soon as they can.
Right.
Ultimately, if it's a hit, then no, we want to support it a lot longer than that and let people, continue making money off of this year after year.
So what's the response been like? I mean, obviously you've had your critics, and but
I think the critics are there are critics. The response has been far more positive than I would have thought. I kind of gauge how well this goes down by seeing just sort of neutral cover on this and seeing like what are the positive or at least willing to hear more comments versus, no, this is terrible, this sucks. And what I've seen, it's been like 15, 20 to 1 positive versus like really against it. Another misconception we get a lot is, the consumer action is completely out of our hands. That might not, that might not be the case, but for this initiative that we're trying to push, it would not be retroactive, which means it doesn't apply to stuff that's already come out. Mostly, we wouldn't even have that authority. That's not how the law works there. So this wouldn't, if a lot of games are at risk now, this might not necessarily save them, but it would create a date that, like, from this point onward in 2027 or something,
right?
That, okay, if you're selling a new game after this, you're on the hook for having an end of life plan once you shut it down. So, and see, a lot of criticism comes not knowing that, because they'll look at some game that was never designed for this. They might have licenses at the company that they literally aren't allowed to release code that might save the game because they cut a deal with some other company and they don't have permission for that. For games like that, they'd either have to shut down before that date, or else they'd be kind of grandfathered in, or depending on what the EU would decide. Or if it wasn't too hard for them, then they could come up with an end of life plan. It's like, okay, we'll hire a guy. We still have the code. It'll take him a week to come up with a patch so you can host this on your own, and then we'll release that at the end of life.
So what is the? I'm sorry. What has the response been from like a? I'm assuming you spoke with some politicians about this, or is this like
a few actually?
And what's the response been to that? Has it just been like, you stupid gamer people, or is it? Like,
I think the vast majority don't even care, or aren't even aware of it.
Right.
Politicians typically don't care about video games unless there's something protecting children or gambling.
Right.
Pretty much anything outside of that, they just don't really care. The ones we did talk to, it was just dumb luck actually that they kind of jumped onto it. They were for this, but they fortunately got voted out. So we're kind of back on our own again. So
this is an uphill battle, to say the least.
Oh, in every way.
All right. Okay. So you're fighting against big multi-billion-dollar global companies, and you're just saying, hey, just.
It's not as lopsided as it sounds with that, because again, with the U.S., they've already won. Like this, the law was settled on this back when I was in high school. I just didn't even realize it. See, really, because the laws might actually not be on their side. Yeah, it's insane to think about that. Industry worth billions has been doing stuff this entire time that the law just doesn't cover.
Right.
Again, analogy I bring up all the time is Uber. When that first came on the scene, governments weren't sure, wait, is this a taxi service, or are these employees or contractors? The law just wasn't written for something like that. And that's really where it is, even though this practice has been going on a couple decades now.
Well, this is a really interesting conversation, and I totally get what you're fighting for. I think that it's an important fight from a consumer perspective of, like, I think all you're asking for is a little bit of clarity, a little clarification on how these things are working. And we have seen, I think Steam updated their terms of service saying like, hey, you don't actually own these things. Didn't they do something like that recently, or EA did?
Yeah. Though that was, I think that was probably in response to this California bill that came through, where they said you have to. Even that has some loopholes in it, but that's basically saying that you can't be so sneaky with the language. Like if you're saying purchase or buy, then you have to be more explicit that you don't actually own this. And so that's not quite accurate to say that. Clarity I'm looking at is like the second prize. The main thing I'm trying to do is just try to stop games from being destroyed as a norm in the industry. And the best analogy for what we're trying to do is actually what Australia did several years back with refunds for digital games. Because you probably remember, well, maybe less so on console, but on the PC, it used to be if you bought a PC game, that as soon as that left the store, that's it. You can't refund that. They're not going to take it back. And that kind of carried through digitally until Australia, their consumer agency, went and sued Valve over it because this violated laws that were on the books for it. Valve lost that case. And so not only did they decide to finally start offering refunds for Australians, but they implemented it worldwide. And then a lot of the industry just kind of went along with it because it just wasn't worth them fighting it just in every country, having one court case after another. So it became the path of least resistance. And that's what we're trying to do here with an end of life plan, because this does not have to be the most expensive thing in the world for companies. If we were trying to stop loot boxes, yeah, they would fight that to hell and back, because that could be worth billions to the industry. So it's an existential risk for some of them. We're just trying to say, no, you just need to have something so that the consumer isn't completely screwed at the end of this.
That's what it feels like for sure. All right, I wanted to get your thoughts. Well, is there anything else we need to know about this? How can people
Probably.
support
What's
you?
the chat saying? I
Well,
could.
chat is very intrigued by what
Okay,
you're
I
saying.
can answer any question you have, but there's like 50 elements once you start drilling into the details. I never know where people's minds are going to go on this.
All right, well, you guys, if you have questions, fire them away in the chat. Marius says, "I see what you're doing, Apple." Oh, we'll get to that here in just a second. Let's see. Scrap Gamer says, "Hey, here's an interesting fact. Games like Loadout, Lawbreakers, Battleborn, Evolve, and others are not completely dead. In fact, they're still being kept alive by the fans." Yeah, this is
Really, Lawbreakers. I didn't know that. That one was dead for a while.
yeah. I mean, that's interesting, and they're available until they're not, until the big bad corporation comes in and
Well, that already happened, I think, with several of those. See what happens. Actually, we actually did some statistics on this for another politician, or consumer group rather. We found that out of the games that shut down, about a quarter of them come back through fans, which is, I find, almost staggering, because that is so much work to reverse engineer a server emulator. It's like in one video, I compared it to kind of cracking the code the Germans were using in World War II, only to get comments saying, no, it's harder. Like, that's what people...
Mercenary says, "Hey Ross, wasn't there a publisher or developer that went out of their way to basically make a game brick your computer? I remember there's a story out there of such company doing this on the way out. Do you recall this?
Not that I'm aware of, unless probably not on purpose. So that you could actually get sued for other things there, that if you're spilling over and wrecking your system.
Patrick Gasol says, City of Heroes is still around with several independent servers. There you go.
Yeah, although City of Heroes is a weird one, because that was shut down, and I think nobody could play it for a few years, but then they came back and then offered licenses, and now I think it's safe. That one's kind of an odd one.
That guy Gus says, Ross, love you, 100% behind the idea of yours. Question: what would you say to someone whose criticism is that government regulating things always makes it worse, like the cafe or small trucks? I
can see where you're coming from. I guess the first thing to know is this is the last resort. I kept hoping like this would kind of get resolved one other way, or there was another way around this, but I think there was a stat not long ago that said something like 95% of big studios have like a live service game planned. Like, it just keeps kind of escalating. The other thing is, from our perspective, we have almost, from speaking personally, the worst thing that can happen to a game that you like is that it's destroyed and you can never play it again.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't see how it gets much worse than that. So we're almost from a standpoint of not having much to lose. I'm completely with you in that this could screw up and then they pass some regulation that doesn't fix things at all. But I think because we are in this weird legal gray area, that it's kind of begging for some sort of resolution one way or the other, that I'm open to another way to do this, but I haven't found it, is the way I'm looking at it.
Winterfell says, Ross, we needed a hero when Concord, a hit arena game, was shut down. The community was broken. Craig was very sad. Blabs won't even talk about her pain. Look at the pain on her face.
To add more to the pain, Concord is another weird example where this is kind of the exception to the rule, because what they did with Concord is they refunded everybody.
Yes.
And so if they actually, nobody won in Concord. Everybody loses with Concord, because how much did Sony dump into that? It was like 200 million or something.
Rumors are close to 5. Hey, nobody won, Ross, except for me. Let's go. All right.
Yeah. So if that's never the plan, or at least we're not. At least I don't think we're at that level of scam in businesses yet, where the plan is to have something like the producers, where the plan is for the game to intentionally fail. So companies have plenty of motivation to not release a product that they have to literally refund everyone and spend hundreds of millions of dollars
Right.
to just pour down the drain. So Concord's a weird exception but something like Lawbreakers, I don't think anybody got refunded on that. And that was out for, I think, about a year before it got killed. So it absolutely would apply to something like that.
The Golden Nugget Gamer says EU regularly gives Microsoft and Apple giant fines when they are trying to be anti-consumer. A big case was the Apple cable didn't adhere to EU law of standard USB cable for your phone. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they've shown. I honestly cannot tell you which way the EU might go on this. Again, without the initiative, I think with the initiative, this happens. But just on their own, I can't tell which way they're going to blow, because they might decide, yeah, no, we're just not going to deal with this, and video game buyers are going to have no rights, and we're just going to sweep this under the rug. Or they might decide, yeah, this really is kind of a mess. We need to come up with something. But if I thought this was hopeless, I never would have attempted it, because that's why I've kind of given up on the US, unfortunately.
Well, I think that's, there's so many people who see things, the initiatives in the gaming space, and they just throw them off to the side as, whatever, for whatever reason. I'm sure you've been called a grifter. Have you been called a grifter yet, Ross?
Only a little bit, because I really tried to go out of my way to just not say, oh, please send money for this, because I needed a place to send it to. It's like, okay, if we have millions of dollars, we could probably do more. But if it's like, if we have 100, well, I don't know if that's really going to do much. So
right. Tidipig Rancher came in, says the City of Heroes server code was smuggled out by a still nameless dev because NCSoft shut down Paragon Studios with zero warning. There was a secret server for years before a leak within its community made it public. Wow.
Yeah,
awesome.
see, that's another thing. A lot of developers don't like this either,
Yeah. He continued, says that the people running the server then contacted NCSoft to negotiate a license agreement as long as it's non-profit. I played City of Heroes since its closed beta, both officially and secretly. Ooh, nice. Thank you so much, Tidipig Rancher. That's, you were saying, I'm sorry.
No, I didn't want to have you lose the message there.
Yeah, but you were saying that devs don't even.
Yeah, I mean, because if you've spent years of your life on a game, and then at the end of it, nobody can even play it, and just all you have for it's like, oh yeah, here's some YouTube video of it. I mean, that has to sting a little bit. It'll depend on the developer, but my favorite example of this is hearsay, but I've heard the developers for The Crew, that game that kind of helped kick this off, they're in favor of this because, at Ivory Tower, they were the developer, Ubisoft is the publisher.
Right.
That, it's like, yeah, we spent years on this game. Of course we want people who want to keep playing it to play it.
Right, naturally.